Welcome back to our channel. Today we'll be discussing the election of George Washington and how it was far weirder than you may have ever imagined. So stay with us to the end, and don't forget to like and subscribe. The first American presidential election took place in 1789, and it was conducted significantly differently from how they are now. There were no declared contenders in 1789. For the position, there was no campaigning. Political parties, conventions, and primary elections were non-existent. The entire campaigning period was extremely brief. The Constitution itself was a key topic in this election, along with whether or not they would maintain the system that served as its foundation. Well, so you might be wondering why a president was chosen for the first time in 1789. They didn't declare their independence until 1776. What did they do for those 13 years? Well, during those 13 years, they were without a president. It's crucial to keep in mind that the United States of America was not always a single nation. It was made up of 13 different nations. The 13 colonies that were taking part in the uprising had all been independent of one another. Distinct colonies with ties to Britain but few, if any, ties among the various colonies. As a result, when the 13 colonies proclaimed their independence, they did so as 13 different nations working together to achieve their shared objective of freedom from British domination, rather than as a single united nation as they would today. The Continental Congress served as the only functioning branch of government at the federal level, albeit it would be a stretch to refer to it as such because there was no such thing as a federal government. Any action taken by the Continental Congress had to be carried out by the states. However, states were not required to do so. This was viewed as a concern at the time by some, and they believed that a closer union between the states would benefit them. This was done mostly for monetary motives. In 1787, a constitutional conference was held in Philadelphia to draft a new constitution for the United States, which created a government with 3 branches: legislative, executive, and judiciary. The previous Continental Congress system only had one branch. The new system included 2 legislative houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate, with Congress as a whole in charge of the legislative branch. The president was in charge of the executive branch, with all those responsible for carrying out laws reporting to them. Following that, the Supreme Court served as the head of the judicial branch, with other courts serving as its subordinates. So, how are they going to elect the president was one of the concerns that the Constitution's creators had to address. Now, one apparent option would be to have Congress choose him. That would effectively transform it into a parliamentary one. So, how else were they going to choose the president? One possibility, which I believe the majority of Americans would take for granted today, was for the president to be chosen by popular vote. That notion didn't sit well with the Constitution's framers either. They believed doing that would not only be foolish, but also impractical. The framers, therefore, came up with a different method that was neither of those two. They would have the renowned Electoral College, a group of people who work only within the executive branch, preventing any potential conflict with the legislative branch. The Electoral College's sole responsibility would be to choose the president every 4 years. The framers are the individuals who met in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 to design the Constitution. The U.S. states are responsible for choosing the Electoral College candidates. They can either select them themselves or leave it up to the people to decide. The presidential election has 2 phases. First, the selection of the electors, and then the election of the president by the electors. Americans vote for electors in early November, and the electors convene in mid-December to vote for the president. The dates of the presidential election and the election of the electors are chosen by Congress. The electors in the first U.S. presidential election were chosen on January 7th, and they gathered on February 4th to select the president. Election day was therefore January 7th in 1789. We would refer to that as Election Day. Now, some online sites will claim that this specific presidential election took place between 1780 and 1789. Not entirely true. It was held on January 7, 1789. Only recently, in 1789, the 1789 election saw 11 states running for office. North Carolina and Rhode Island were technically outside the United States and did not take part in the election since they had rejected the Constitution. In 5 of the states, the electors were chosen by the state legislature. In 4 of the states, voters chose the electors directly. Thereafter, a mixed method was used in 2 more states. The Constitution was opposed by a large number of people at the time, and its adoption was very contentious in several states. The Constitution, in the opinion of some Americans, betrayed the objectives of the Revolutionary War. They felt like they had traded one tyranny for another. After removing the tyranny of the British Parliament and the British monarchy, a new federal system was now being implemented. Many Americans, particularly those who lived in rural and western areas, were concerned that the federal government would be controlled by port city business interests and would work against their interests under this new federal system. They would make decisions about public policy that would economically favor large port cities and disfavor rural areas. In reality, due to the division in the New York legislature, the debate between supporters and opponents of the Constitution ultimately prevented New York from voting in the presidential election. The majority of Federalists comprised the Senate, the upper house. The majority of the Assembly, the lower chamber, opposed federalism. Practically speaking, that would mean that all 8 of New York's electors would be against the Constitution. As a result, the Assembly would approve a law stating how electors would be chosen. Senate would consider it. No, we're not going to do it that way, the Senate would reply. They would pass a law on their own, send it back to the Assembly for approval, and the Assembly would reject it. The conference committee was consulted. They quarreled about it, unable to resolve the issue. Weeks passed during this. As January 7th rolled around, they were at a standstill. As a result, as of midnight on January 7th, they still hadn't selected their electors. They possessed no electors. Because senators were chosen by the state legislature, the same impasse meant that New York was without senators. They didn't select who their senators would be until, I believe, the summer of 1789. Although the Constitution was ultimately accepted in these 11 states, many individuals found it unsettling, and they intended to hold a second convention to address their concerns. So, looking back, the promises made by those who supported the Constitution when it was ratified in the various states appear a little dubious, but they responded, well, okay, let's ratify the Constitution right away. We assure you that later on, we'll embrace changes. They voted for the Constitution knowing that it wasn't truly binding, but with the idea that additions would be enacted in the future. This is what happened. And the result was the Bill of Rights, which went into effect in 1791. Washington was going to be president, and everyone knew it. While the Constitution was written in 1787, they already recognized that. One of Virginia's delegates, George Washington, was present when they were discussing the presidency. It was somewhat known that George Washington would be the first person to hold the position after it was established, and he was seated there in the room during that discussion. Hence, the Federalists were concerned that anti-Federalist voters may skew the results. How would they go about doing that? The Constitution's framers established this system in which electors would choose 2 candidates for president instead of 1. The winner of the election would then take office as president, and the runner-up would take office as vice president. The system of the Electoral College was meant to have the president and vice president elected based on the number of votes received, with the former receiving the most votes and the latter receiving the second highest number of votes. However, there was a flaw in the system. If George Washington didn't receive a majority of the votes, the anti-Federalist voters could rig the election in favor of John Adams. To prevent this, political leaders, including Alexander Hamilton, urged the electors not to vote for Adams. In the 1789 election, most people voted for Washington, followed by Adams, and some voted for other candidates, some of which were intentional throwaway votes. Well, until they addressed it. This structure in which the electors would vote for the president by selecting 2 names and failing to specify which one they wanted to be president, and which one vice president, remained an issue in each subsequent presidential election. Finally, it was corrected in the 12th Amendment, which stated that electors must specify who they are voting for president and vice president. John Adams was severely affected by the election results. He didn't anticipate being elected president. After all, he shared the expectation of everyone else that Washington would win the most electoral votes. Nonetheless, he did not anticipate receiving as few electoral votes as he did, and he was rather devastated by it. President George Washington was chosen. John Adams was chosen as the running mate. They both went to New York, the original location of the federal government, and were sworn in to start their first terms there in the spring of 1789, respectively. It's a little depressing since it didn't have to go that way. The anti-Federalists didn't pull off a ruse, so they didn't have to worry about that. All the worries about anti-Federalist mischief were unfounded. Adams couldn't get more electoral votes than Washington, who comfortably won all 69 of them. And that's how the first U.S. presidential election played out. It was a strange and flawed system, but it set the foundation for future elections. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel.